All right, I think we're good to go. Thank you very much for coming to my talk. I'll talk to you a little bit about localization and translation today. My name is Denis. I've been involved in the gaming industry for over 10 years, working as a translator, as a cyber sports player, as a localizer, as a playtester. So I'd like to share some of my experience with you today and shed a bit of light on why design for localization is important and why you as designers should care about that at the very early stages of your game design. Firstly, I'd like to define what I mean when I say localization and how it is different to translation. Mostly people will have heard of translation or will have encountered it in one way or another, and it does encompass simply converting your lines, your text, your audio from your target language to another language. But localization encompasses something bigger. It encompasses adapting your game, adapting your concepts and your ideas into the target language and into the target culture. Because some of the jokes you may have written might not make sense in another language, or some of the ideas and concepts you talk about might be offensive or might be misunderstood in another culture. So that's why having a whole team involved to work with you on that can be very important. Poor localization can have a lot of very negative impacts on your game. Some of them are more obvious than others. Your players in another language might not enjoy the game as much as they could have, and they immediately will mirror their experience onto the game itself and say, oh, this game was bad, which might not be the case, right? It might have to do just with translation. And then there's the more obvious impacts of negative reviews, and as a business you might have monetary implications because you are diverting some of your potential audience. But to me, as a game designer, one of the most tragic things that could happen during bad localization, poor translations, is that your worlds and your characters are not represented the way you intended for them to. You've designed your game to have a certain flow, to have a certain idea, and those ideas could be lost. Imagine beginning a new game and getting really excited about this new world, new characters, and getting really sucked into this universe, and then character pops up on the screen and says something that is grammatically incorrect or sounds silly. All of that immersion that you as a designer have spent hours and hours so carefully creating for your player is instantly shattered because they're instantly thrown out of that environment snickering or going, what are they supposed to mean? And your characters that you've designed to perhaps be menacing or intimidating or enigmatic suddenly are just silly, and your player loses the respect that you've tried to build in them for this character. And to me, that is one of the most important reasons why we should focus on localization and translation a lot. But you as a designer might ask, well, why should I care? I'm paying money to somebody to do that for me. And that's true, and you only can hope that they'll do their job to their best. But what you as a designer must understand is that languages do not work the same way. And languages work very differently from English. Some of you may have had exposure to other languages if you've studied them as a second language, which is very different from being bilingual. If you can speak multiple languages from birth, that's very different from studying a language academically, because only then you can grasp the concepts of grammatical gender, the concepts of declension, and so on and so forth, which we'll talk about in a second. That grammar and other languages work so differently from English that solutions that you may have not even thought at any stage of your design are required, because your translators are simply not able to perform their job well. It's not that the quality of their work is not good, it's that they can't fit their vision of how the translation should work into the infrastructure that you've created, because it doesn't cater for the demands of other languages. I've got a few examples of grammatical concepts that exist in other languages that are very different from English. Grammatical gender, that some of you may be familiar with. In English, we don't have this concept, but say in Russian, any word or any person belongs to one of three genders, whether it's masculine or feminine or neuter. And this creates a lot of problems when you start creating text. If you have a character that is supposed to deliver a line, that line will be different depending on whether the speaker is masculine or feminine. And it opens a whole other can of worms when we talk about non-binary people and other languages that are struggling to cope, to keep up with this concept. And particularly Russian is a language that I've worked the most with, so I'll be using a lot of examples from Russian. Is a language that is extremely unequipped to handle concepts that are outside of this traditional binary structure. Other languages have declensions. What that means is that the way we perceive words in those languages and the way they function in sentences changes. They acquire different suffixes, prefixes, and endings depending on their role in a sentence. And if you don't have an infrastructure to cater for that, if you're just trying to plug and paste words into your sentence depending on some variables, that might just not work like this in another language. Here is an example I've got. Let's say you have a character who goes on a hunt for a legendary weapon. And it might be, the outcome of their hunt might be different. Maybe they find a sword, maybe they find a spear, maybe it's a shield, or maybe they don't find anything. You might be tempted to, let's say you have a big narrative structure, you might be tempted to then use that word and just plug it into all of your narrative and all of your lines depending on the outcome of the search, of the quest of what your character's found. And it's really easy in English where it's just sword. Wherever it is, whatever it does, however you use it, as long as it's a single sword, it's always going to be sword. If you look at Russian, the word has 6 different forms depending on its function in a sentence. And then using color here, I've highlighted how its endings will change depending on whether the word is the subject of the sentence, meaning that the sword is maybe talking to your character. Maybe the sword is possessed by some sort of ghost and it is talking to the character. Or whether the character is talking about the sword or whether they're using it. Depending on the function of that word in a sentence, its ending is going to change. Also for Russian, it's important to know whether the word is inanimate or not, because that will also determine how it changes and behaves in a sentence. Here is an example that might be a little bit closer to home, where you can see how you can bump into problems even in English. Let's say you have a spell that deals 5 damage to 2 targets. And let's say the spell is dynamic. As your character levels up, it changes, or maybe during the battle they get buffed and suddenly they can deal 50 damage instead of 5, and suddenly the number of targets changes. So even in English, you can see behind the display text that the player sees, this is what the source could look like, where you will use variables to determine, well, how many targets are you actually targeting, how many damage are you actually dealing. And even in English, if you have a single target, then you should phrase it as 1 target suffers. And if you have plural, 2 targets suffer. So you have to offer a choice to your system. You have to stitch in this infrastructure that will automatically decide the choice that needs to be made for the display version of the text the player sees. And if we talk about Russian, things get even worse, because in English, pretty much everything is determined by plurality versus singularity, whilst it's not the case in Russian. Firstly, there are 3 forms of the word. Secondly, they have nothing to do with whether it's singular or plural, but has everything to do with the last digit of the number that is used to describe that, which makes no sense to anybody, but that's what we have to work with. Say if it's 1 or 21 or 31, that's one form. If it's 42, that's another form, and so on and so forth. So you have 3 choices here, but then when you look at the verbs, there are 2 choices, because now there's another disconnect between the 2 there, that the first verb is used with the first and a third form, and the second verb is used with the second form. So it can get very confusing very quickly. So that's just an example for you. Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. A game I'd like to address that ran into major issues during localization is Return of the Obra Dinn by Lucas Pope. You can find a full interview on YouTube, and I really suggest you check it out. It's very interesting, and he goes into a lot more detail than I will in describing the issues they ran into. For those of you who have not played it, and by the way, it's an incredible puzzle solver game, Lucas Pope, the way that he's designed the game is it's a mystery game where there's the ship full of people that have disappeared or died mysteriously, and you need to work out what happened to them. And the way you do it is you have this diary where you select the people, you have a log of the ship, and you select the people, and you tell the game what happened to those people. For example, you might say, Johnny shot Mary. Captain Johnny shot First Mate Mary, for example. Or somebody stabbed somebody, or some undescribed sea beast speared somebody. The game gets really interesting very quickly. And so the way Lucas Pope intended for the puzzle-solving mechanisms of the game to function is he wanted for the voice of the sentence to be active. And what that means is he wanted the sentences to be structured in a very particular way, to say, Mary shot Johnny, to show deliberation, to show action, to show that everything that happened on that boat wasn't an accident. Everything was going according to some plan, some design. That was his intention. When he started working with localizers, he instantly ran into big roadblocks where they said, we can't do it. Because in English, you can spare somebody, you can knife somebody, but you can't do it in Russian, you can't do it in German. You can kill somebody with a knife, sure, you can stab somebody with a spear, but then if you talk about a spear, well, what kind of spear is it? Is it a spear that Romans used, or is it a spear of some undescribed monstrosity weapon-like type? Things like this matter to translators for them to be able to select the word that would most accurately fit their description, because in the end it will change the way your players will perceive the game. They don't want these sentences to be read clunky. They don't want for them to sound, that's a bit off, right? We want to make sure we focus on selecting correct words. So in the end, what he ended up doing is he needed to restructure the sentences to be in a passive voice, to say Captain Johnny was shot with a gun by First Mate Stewart or something like that. And he did say that it wasn't the choice that he would have wanted to make as a designer, but this is another important takeaway from my talk, that you as a designer have to be prepared to make sacrifices and have to be prepared to find middle ground with your translators and your localizers in certain things. Let's step away a little bit from grammar and genders. It's a very complicated subject, and I'm not expecting to be able to explain all of it in 15 minutes, and it is very language dependent as well. That's why working with a team of localizers is really, really important, because they are the experts that know what makes their language work, and they'll be able to give you tools and tips on how to make their language fit in with your game. Stepping away from grammar, let's consider a few other things that are food for thought, that are interesting ideas. Using text and images, you will eventually run into situations where you're going to have to do that. If you go to localize your game, do you go to the extent of localizing every single neon bar name that your character sees, every single book that is on the shelf in their bedroom? Where do you stop? Where do you draw the line? Say, and here reads RPD, Raccoon Police. If I don't speak English, I don't know what that means, what any of that means. So you as a designer, if you decide not to go to the degree of translating everything, which doesn't just involve the effort of the translators team, but suddenly you have to redraw all your images to include this text, or do you paste the text over it so it is not a dynamic object, right? This is another solution to the problem. But if you don't go to that length, how do you communicate this information to the player? Because this information might be really, really important for them to know before they enter this building. What are they expecting to find in there? Are you going to use subtitles that are going to pop up? How is this going to affect immersion, where your player suddenly has to stop looking at what they were doing and read the text at the bottom of the screen? Or are you going to have your character say something and comment on it and say, oh, that's the police department. Wonder what's inside. Consider how it will affect immersion for your players. Let's say your intent is to throw in your player into this completely new environment. that they're just going to discover, that is supposed to be foreign to them, supposed to feel strange, weird, and uncomfortable, then using a foreign language could actually be one of your tools. You could leave it the way it is and make your player feel uncomfortable, make them feel like they don't know where they are. They can't quite understand these things around them. But be mindful of not missing key information and key details. Or maybe it could be a worst enemy, the other way around. Let's say your character and your player are in their hometown. This is where they've grown up and have known every nook and cranny of the city. And suddenly they can't read the road sign that tells them the name of the street. How is this going to affect the connection that your player is creating to their character? Consider how other cultures perceive color. And this is something that, in my experience, not a lot of people know. And I apologize for my very poor paint job. I'm not a graphic designer by any extent of imagination. If you ask a native Russian speaker to cut all blue wires on this bomb, they're going to cut exactly one wire, because the two leftmost wires are distinctly different color. The second color from the left isn't just a shade of blue, a light blue. It has its own name, and it's so ingrained in your brain when you grow up that you cannot distinguish this color from being whatever its name in the target language is. The way to think about it in English is consider red and pink. They are so distinct and different to us, but in essence, they can be very similar colors on the extremes. They can be sort of more of one color could be a shade of the other, really. Consider that. As a designer, prepare to let go of your favorite joke. Maybe you've written a piece of narrative that you think is the funniest and the most hilarious or the most exciting thing you've ever written. And here's an example of it was from one of the kids' game we had to work on. And there's this pirate character, and he says, "Oh, I see you're back," and obviously he's using homophones because he's a pirate, and instead of C-S-E, he says C-S-E-A. And then in the next line, he actually acknowledges it, because the game is all done in bubble speeches. There's no audio. So he actually acknowledges it, and in the next line, he says, "Gosh, I've been waiting for so long to make this joke, because it only works in writing. And now finally, here is my chance." Now, consider translating this to Russian. A, homophones do not work the same way in Russian. You cannot come up with a homophone for C or anything nautical. That wouldn't sound clumsy. Secondly, humor doesn't work like this in Russian. You can't make puns. Puns is something that is not a concept in Russian that exists. And then there's a third layer to it, that this entire pirate culture, this yar kind of speak and language, is not a thing either. So you're losing your player on 3 completely different levels if you're just trying to directly translate this joke. So what we ended up doing in this case, we actually had to completely scrap the original text, and this is where you, as a designer, as I mentioned, have to prepare to work with the translators team and offer them alternative solutions. And we said, well, what if this pirate instead in Russian, he's singing a little shanty that somehow every Russian person knows from when they were a kid. Excuse me. And it's a shanty that is traditionally sang by a female. And now suddenly this pirate, this badass looking pirate, is kind of humming it along. And it makes your player smile when they read it or they hear it and they go, "Oh yeah, that's right, I know this song." And this is something we do as translators and as localizers. We don't just take your text and we translate it and we feed it to our target audience. We are trying to dig deeper. What is the emotion you're trying to evoke with this line? Are you trying to make your player laugh? You're trying to make them think about something or view this character in a silly way? Well, we can make it happen just through other means and allow us the means to go and do that. And that's why we have to work with designers as well, because, well, what if something we propose is actually doesn't fit in with characters development, right? And in this instance, this was a very small side character, so it didn't matter. But if it was somebody who had a major part in the story, then you have to be more careful on working of how to adapt that and how to make that happen. Consider the length of the target language. That's the same word. I use that off Google, so if anybody speaks Mandarin and that's wrong, I apologize. But Mandarin here takes up about about half of what English does, and then Russian takes up about 3 times. And this isn't just some bookish example of a word that I use to make you go, whoa, that looks crazy. That's a real word that you just use in your everyday language. How is your game going to handle that? If you have speech bubbles, are they going to be flexible? Are they going to change their size? Are you going to use font sizing where you're going to shrink your text? Or will it ever reach a point where it's going to be too small to read? Are you going to have little scroll bars where your character can scroll through the dialogue? How is this going to affect your design decisions? Because having scroll bars might not be what you have wanted originally, right? They have this, it's a design decision in the game, again, that in my opinion can affect immersion. So this is something for you to consider as well. Give context to your translators. When we're working on lines, we often don't necessarily have access to the game. So if I see a line that says fire and I have 0 context, I have no idea if somebody is reaching out for help because their house is burning down, somebody's shooting an arrow, or somebody's losing their job. Cooperate with your translators and your localizers. Give them as much information as you can. The best experience I've had working with with overcoming this issue was working on Steam translation services with Valve, where they allow you to instantly export the translations that you've done and straight up jump into the game to the part of the game or to the part of the UI where that translation features. So you can instantly tell, does this make sense? Is this what that character is trying to say and is trying to do? And here's an example that I've really wanted to give you. It's a game called Lost Words. I don't know if any of you have heard of it or played it. That kind of summarizes everything I was talking about in a really, really neat way. It's a game about this little girl, and she does her journaling, and it's a little adventure she goes on. And it's a really clever idea and concept where in the game, the words and the lines that she says, they're used as platforms. So you have to jump about and find your way out. And in this example, as the player, you're moving this word to help her jump over this massive gap. And coincidentally, it fits in sensibly with the sentence. What is this going to do in another language? How much longer or shorter your word is going to be? How much will your sentences change? Are you going to be presenting your player with a completely different platforming challenge just because the language has made you do that? What if your language spills out into multiple lines? How is your engine going to handle multiple platforms, one after another? Consider that. Or here, on the left page, she's talking about unlocking her feelings, and it's a really clever little puzzle where you can drag this word to the right and you can open the gate that opens the way to the next passage. But say in Russian, you cannot use the same word to describe feelings and describe opening a gate. And such a clever puzzle like this is going to be somehow twisted to make it work. And as translators, we usually are able to find ways. We can use synonyms, and there's many ways to make things work. But some of them feel really tense and they feel really uncomfortable just because we are forced to go and do something that doesn't quite make sense, but we have to make it work. And sometimes we have character limits, and it's understandable from a designer and a publisher point of view. You want your text to fit in a reasonable margin. But that forces us to throw away some of the options that we could have had. That could have been, you might write this line and go, this is perfect for this character, this is exactly what they should say. And it's 150% over the limit. And you go, oh, now I have to throw all of my colorful words, and now she's just this boring character who's just telling you something about something that's lost all its appeal. In this little puzzle from the same game, here you are arranging words to, again, kind of make sense and make a little platform. Word order in other languages might be very different from English, and you can't necessarily put subject first and then you're trying to plug in a verb after that. Also here you're saying you can't cork nature, blah blah blah, can't put a cork. Can't is a separate particle in English. In other languages it might not be. It might be a suffix or a prefix, so suddenly this extra platform that you had might not necessarily fit anywhere in theory. One takeaway for you from this talk is, if you're able, involve translators, involve localizers as early as you can in your project. Let them play the game, let them play with lines, let them give you feedback on how they think the game could be structured, on how you could improve your infrastructure for them. Give them the tools to be able to do their job well. As I mentioned before, maybe you're using placeholders, or maybe you're using some other structures that help you pick what language, what words, what forms of the words should be used in your sentence. Use mapping when you start playtesting your game in another language. Use maps that show you where your players have been, where your playtesters have been. Because what if there is some weird cave on the outside of the world that nobody's ventured into, and something is very, very wrong that is happening with the language in that cave? So that's another solution that some designers use. Cooperate with your translators. Provide them, as I mentioned, provide them with information. Be flexible. Accept their feedback. Accept the need to change things around. And it can be really hard, because when you're a designer and you have a vision, you have to break out of it, and it can be really difficult. But the goal behind it is to deliver your game to the target language in the way you've intended it to, for your characters to be the way you wanted for them to be. And bringing your game to life in another language and another culture is really magical. And when you get players from all over the globe and across the world, when you get them to experience your game and enjoy it, it's a very rewarding feeling. So put a lot of effort into it. It's really important. Thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, you can come up to me after the talk, or find me somewhere in the hallways of the conference, and I'll be happy to answer that. So thank you.